Today's episode was recorded in front of a live audience at the MIT Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts on February 14th, 2026, as part of the museum's year-long focus on time. Please be sure to check out our other episodes, including one with Jack Antonoff and astrophysicist David Kaiser on the topic of black holes. If you're a regular listener of Sing for Science and want to support the show, the best way you can support us is to leave us a review and tell a friend about the podcast. Thanks for listening.
So there's this, thing called time dilation and length dilation, and it has been scientifically proven that if you travel at greater speeds, speeds closer to the speed of light, time slows down.
We all know we gotta die someday. Slow it down for me, yeah. Slow it down for me, yeah. I wanna remember just like this.
Welcome to Sing for Science, the show where musicians and scientists talk about music and science. I'm your host, Matt White. Each week we'll talk about a song by our guest artist and how it connects with our guest scientist's area of expertise. Today we're speaking with Grammy-winning artist Miguel. His latest album, CAOS, is his most introspective to date and explores personal transformation witnessed through the lens of fatherhood, loss, and aging. The song Nearsight, SID, or Slow It Down, considers our strange relationship with time, how it speeds up as we age, and how that acceleration can flood us with both regret and nostalgia for moments we can't reclaim. Also joining us is author and science historian, Jimena Canales. Jimena's most well-known work is The Physicist and the Philosopher, Einstein, Bergson, and the Debate That Changed Our Understanding of Time. The book examined what's at the crux of Einstein's theory of relativity, how it challenges our most basic experience of time by showing that time can warp and bend, and that it's actually a dimension just like length or width, woven into the fabric of space itself. The title of this week's episode on the podcast is Slow It Down, the Physics and Philosophy of How We Perceive Time. Cambridge, Massachusetts, please help me welcome Miguel and Jimena Canales.
Hi everyone, how you guys doing?
I'm going to start out by asking you a question that's maybe of little interest to anyone else in this room but me, and it's about how you title your songs. This is something that's always fascinated me since I was in high school. So you've titled it Nearsight, SID, with the SID in brackets. So is that a visual thing that you're going for? Is there something more to it?
That's interesting. A little bit visual, and then sometimes now it's just for the ease, but then again I somehow end up making it complicated again. Slow it down. Just if you just boil that down, SID is just But Nearsight is was the idea,
right?
So I titled it for the idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
Someone much more perceptive than me had to point out that SID stood for slow it down, I admit. But you're in good company. I asked.
Not as intuitive as I thought it was going to be.
I asked, the Weezer song, the Sweater Song, because when I was in high school, that was the song, and it was Undone - the Sweater Song. And when I was in high school, I imagined some cigar-chomping record exec being like, "You're calling it the Sweater Song, Weezer. Otherwise, kids aren't going to know what it is." And so I asked him about it when he was on the show. He said, "I just don't like the look of parentheses." And it was that simple.
I love parentheses. That's weird.
So this song is the perfect entry point to what we're talking about, because we're talking about how we perceive time, and the title itself refers to both perception, nearsight, and time. Slow it down. So maybe, I guess, just if you could talk a little bit about what the role that time occupies in this song.
The song is really like about impermanence and how time sometimes moves slower and faster depending on how engaged, or for me, how it's moved faster or slower, depending on how engaged I was in the moments. And maybe my wish to have been more involved and aware of what was happening in the midst of things, as opposed to kind of moving in autopilot. And so it's a bit of a prayer, as well as a recognition of the significance of my own interaction with time, and how that can skew my appreciation or lack of,
Was the hook the first thing, as as you're getting older and you're having these new experiences and you're like, I want to write a song about this sentiment, this feeling I'm having, that things are starting to move too fast. I have these regrets that I wasn't as present, or however you want to put it.
The song actually, that studio session was also one of those moments when a song writes itself, which is a slippage of time in its own right, because the moment the music came on, which is just the guitar riff, I picked up the mic, and the very first verse all the way through to the end of the chorus, that's exactly what...
Including the slow it down lyric.
All of it, yeah. So I got a stock now and a gun. Mm-hmm. I'm watching TV and the news now. It's just me acknowledging, wow, I'm very different than I ever thought I would be. And then the rest kind of just unfolded. I don't really recall.
Yeah.
I remember getting to the end and being like, looking around, and the room was like...
Well, that's another thing I want to ask you, because as musicians, like the phenomenon of how we relate to time, I mean, obviously tempo. I remember, like, if I didn't like how a song was feeling, it felt too slow, and it's interesting, like often bands will play songs too fast live because of the adrenaline, you know what I mean? So what are some of the other ways that you experience time being a little different when you're playing music than in day-to-day life?
Man, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Particularly on stage, the feeling of rhythm is definitely skewed by the adrenaline and the energy that not only I think I have on stage, but also wanting the audience to feel, I guess, more apt to engage in a song and to be in it with you. And most times it's really hard to tell on slower songs if a group of people is really into it. The movement is obviously just physically, the movement is slower too, so it's just harder to perceive. In which case, the easy fix is, let's just speed it up.
Yeah, let's get through this. It's interesting because I did an episode on the show a couple of years ago with Sheila E. and with a Mexican neuroscientist named Hugo Merchant, who studies what's called rhythm entrainment. And he told me the thing, people always ask me, they're like, what's the most mind-blowing thing that you've learned in the 100 episodes you've done? And the first thing I always say is this neuroscientist who studies rhythm entrainment told me that the way that we process rhythm in our brains is in the motor cortex. So when we're feeling a beat, on some level, our brain has to imagine we're moving, which is why dance is so important. But the thing that really blew my mind was that when we sync up, whether kids are clapping in a group or you're connecting with an audience, the brain floods the motor cortex with dopamine. So that's why you feel really good when you lock in, and you really don't when you don't.
That is fascinating. That's incredible.
This is the part, Jimena, where I want you to help make some sense of this whole thing for us, because and was perhaps one of the many reasons why I wanted to ask you to sit down with us, because, like I said, I've interviewed no fewer than 3 scientists on this topic, and I still couldn't explain it to anyone about why time behaves so, or our relationship to it is so counterintuitive. So as kind of a way in, if you were to talk to the Miguel singing in this song, saying, slow it down for me, And he said just what conditions need to be present for it to slow down.
Sure. Well, boredom, right? When we're bored, things slow down. But I'm going to add another layer to the question. So we all understand that subjective time is different from what our clock tells us, right? So the clock is the objective, accurate, and then we feel that time happens in a very different way. It slows down when we're bored. We have these entrenchments. There's rhythm. We can't really slice little units of time because we're always thinking about the future and always the past. I mean, rhythm itself is something that one cannot even think of as a standalone unit of time. It's about the future and it's about the past. So what reality do those time mysteries have in the world of science? What is the space for them? Are they just illusions? Are they just mistakes? And if so, what does that tell us about the world that we live in which the most important aspects of time for ourselves as people, as individuals, don't match up with the time that's objective, that's measurable, that's clock time, that's been described by physicists and even by neuroscientists, because neuroscientists would say, yes, of course, we all know that different people have different views of time and that they perceive it and they may make mistakes, and there's entire areas of time perception in which they put people in isolation chambers and they ask them to estimate the time. They put them in different circumstances, situations, and they don't come up with the same, with the clock time. So the question is, where is that reality? And there's not a clear answer, and I think that it speaks to this divide between the sciences and the humanities. And it speaks to the divide between the arts and the sciences. So I'm delighted, to be talking to a musician here. And I think that just the fact that we're in a science museum and that we have, such a great audience speaks to everyone trying to give an answer to those feelings of time that has not been provided so far.
Well, I need you to throw me a rope here, because I came out here and I said that science has proven over and over again that time is not what we think it is. And I know you just said you weren't going to get into the science of it, but
no.
But
yeah.
Let's talk about how we know that time is not what we think it is, and that it actually can speed up or slow down.
Sure. That's true. So there's this, thing called time dilation and length dilation, and it has been scientifically proven that if you travel at greater speeds, speeds closer to the speed of light, time slows down. And that was one of the main insights of Einstein's theory of relativity. It was proven in this great eclipse expedition in 1919. Since then, there have been many, many experiments. One of them that's most evocative is if you put a clock on an airplane and you send one west and you send one east and they come back, the one that's traveled faster has slowed down by reference to the clock that hasn't traveled. There's the famous twin paradox. So
less time has elapsed on one of those clocks. You're looking at those stopwatches or whatever they are, and it's a lower number.
Yes. What's interesting, the person that's going through that doesn't feel anything different. There's a proper time. So they don't feel, they're looking at their clock and they have no idea that they're being slowed down.
Like Matthew McConaughey in Interstellar.
Right.
Just sobbing.
Right. Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah.
For if a fan made you a video for this, just McConaughey weeping for 3 minutes.
When he gets back to the ship.
Yeah. That is brutal.
Man, it's brutal. I love that movie.
An interesting part of the science, too, is that it changes according to gravitational fields. So time slows down the closer you are to a strong gravitational center, and it's quicker up. So you guys have the time is going quicker than us over here.
The audience, it's going quicker for them than us?
The ones up there.
Why?
Because we're closer to the gravitational field of
the floor.
Of the center.
By how
of the
much
Earth.
really would you say? Like it's got to be like fractions of a fraction.
Yes.
But it's measurable?
It's measurable. It's measurable. That has been measured at higher mountains and lower mountains, and it comes at play with a GPS and time coordination with satellites that need to take into consideration the general theory of relativity in order to coordinate our clocks.
Because this is the other thing I can't get my head around, is that time is a dimension, right? Like length or width. Can you help us make some sense of that? And we're looking at an image right now. This is kind of a classic one that I guess Einstein came up with this, that we're looking at the fabric of space-time, and he talked about a planet as if it were a bowling ball on a mattress.
Exactly. Yeah. So time is just one more dimension next to the three dimensions of space, the X, Y, C, and then there's time. It's a little complicated because it's got a minus sign. But in essence, we are living. The universe is a four-dimensional universe of warping space-time, and it just the time varies according to the gravitational field, which is one of the reasons that's connected to velocity as well. But yes, so these things are noticeable, and as I said, everyday technologies have to take them into consideration. Mm-hmm. But how does that then match up with the neuroscience of time, the subjective, the fact that if something's boring and it speeds up, music, rhythm. And as a historian, I've looked at that episode in quite detail, and I've centered on one day, which is April 6, 1922, and it was a day in which Einstein had this debate with a French philosopher known as Henri Bergson, and Henri Bergson was more famous than Einstein at the time. He was in the audience. Einstein was supposed to give a talk on the theory of relativity, and Bergson, raised up his hand and made a comment about what place in Einstein's theory would the subjective notion of time. And Einstein basically said, there's no time of the philosophers. The time of the philosophers does not exist. And that started off a debate between philosophy and science, and really an impasse about how to think about them in a way that we can understand both, our subjective understanding. One where clocks have meaning and are used by us to go to things that interest us. And
that was Bergson's position.
That was the dialogue, but Einstein basically, he wouldn't move, and he said, those are empty ideas. They have no purchase on reality. Our subjective understanding of time is a mistake, and clock time, and if there's something, so it became really interesting because. He said, you're saying that something that cannot be measured exists, and that's quite a statement, to believe that there's reality out there that cannot be measured is a controversial thing to say. On the other hand, Bergson was like, well, we built clocks because we invent things, and they measure time. Because we want to use them to go to things that interest us. And actually, in his point of view, it's that aspect of time, the unmeasurable aspect of time, which should have a higher purchase on reality. So he tried to change it around. So this is why I think, I'm just, again, sort of delighted to be in conversation, because I think artists, when you're writing your lyrics, you're getting at the truth of not only how you're feeling, but the truth about how time passes in the universe. No, it should have a purchase on how we think about the universe, which contains art, music, and rhythm.
And I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about, as you've gotten older and had a kid, and how that's shaped your sense of time. We have this slide up right now, and someone explained it to me in a way that made a lot of sense, which was like, the reason why time feels like it's going by quicker when you're older is when you're younger, you have fewer experiences to compare it to, right? So you've only lived so long. But as you become an adult and you get into your 30s and your 40s and beyond, you have that many more. So a minute represents a smaller fraction of your time. But I think this slide is saying something else. But before we get to that, I would like to ask you a little bit more about like just your relationship with time, like between being young, and because this song like talks a lot about partying, it just like talks about what life was like then versus what it is now. So specifically, what are your feelings about your relationship to time now that you're a dad and not raging?
Just more intentionally. Still raging, just with a lot more intention these days. I've noticed more now than before how, and I was sort of speaking to this kind of in the outset, how appreciating details actually for me has a slowing down effect, maybe in the way that gravity may. And I don't know if there's some correlation there, maybe more metaphysical, I don't know. But what I will say is maybe it's that the more appreciation I have for the unique things in my day, the less average they seem, and maybe I log them differently. And when you having my son is, every day is a new thing. He's a new person every day. He wakes up with a new word, or he does a new thing, or he has a new skill, or he's trying a new approach. He's had a new fall, or he's wants something new to eat, or he doesn't like something that he did yesterday. All of these things make the experience brand new for me, and so I'm logging them in a new way. And so now time seems much slower than it did in my, let's say, my 30s and my 20s. And before my 20s, I would say it felt the slowest. But I wonder if it's because I, in my own way, was having new experience. More often, I was having new experiences as I was, growing up. And so, yeah, the song is definitely paraphrasing that feeling. In the first verse, it's more about life in general. In the second verse, it's about a moment in time. We can call it the present, or more recent, time frame. And then the end is almost like a fast forward to myself. And in this way, I think I was wanting to capture that feeling of like, when you are looking back, how things seemed more significant. And then in the present, if we're able to do that, how significant it is to pay attention. And then in the future, if we don't pay attention, how significant it was that we didn't. And looking at ourselves and going, damn, I missed a lot. And maybe I wrote the song maybe as a reminder to myself to pay attention. Pay some more attention here. There's a lot of things that are valuable in the experience.
absolutely.
No, I mean, I love hearing you describe this, and the words that you use, attention, right? So how does that affect time? Details, but the most important one, I think, is also the one that's most overlooked when we think about time in science, and that's relationships. Because it's through relationships that we understand and measure our time, and clocks are coordinated, and there is no master clock out there. There's not a clock, and the system through which we actually coordinate clocks is very, very complex, and it's institutional, and it's got all these instruments. But one of my favorite historians of time has a book in which he decided to go and find central time, and he went all over the world to the institutes of time coordination in Paris and the institutes of standards, and at the end of the book, he said, "I didn't find time, but I found people." And again, the descriptions where you're thinking of time with respect to your son, and just thinking of the conversation we had before we entered, that we were comparing time. We talk about time with each other, and differences, I think, in how time flows for us affect our relationships for us individuals, and how they affect our
We keep coming back to the brain, and obviously in this song, Miguel is speaking from his own experience, and so this is a neurological process. I realize that this is not your primary area of expertise, but you're more qualified than either of us. So could you tell us a little bit about the neuroscience of how the brain processes time?
It's they found all these. I think you have another slide where they found there are places in the brain, but a lot of neuroscientists have actually tried to find a clock. Like your computer has a clock, and they haven't been able to find a clock, which I think speaks to the complexity of the actual sort of cognitive aspect of time. But I would return to the thing that torments the question that torments a little bit. What reality should we ascribe to the neuroscience and subjective understanding of time? Is it really just a mistake that doesn't match up with the correct clock time? And if it is, what does that say about how we think about what is right and wrong and correct and measurable in the world?
It's probably why I'm always late. I have way more time than I do.
There's some relation about optimism and being late. Apparently, people who are late are optimists because they think they're going to arrive on time.
That is a really nice way to color it. Have you ever occurred to you? Because you always think of it as some kind of defect. Right. Like, I have problems being on time, but no.
I'm really working on it. I'm doing better. I'm doing better.
If you could, Jimena, just get more specific on what we do know about, I mean, I realize it's something that is very, very elusive, but what are the different processes as we best can understand them?
There could be a neuroscientist in the room. I'm a historian of science. Mm-hmm. I don't feel qualified to talk about the neuroscience of time, beyond the history of the split between the philosophy of time and the scientific notion of time.
Was Bergson, as a philosopher, was he at all drawing from what they knew about the mind at that time? Yeah,
he was extremely informed, and the way that the debate was read, or at the time, and is still read by some people, is that we acknowledge that there are these two notions of time: the objective clock one and the subjective neuroscientific one. That they're different, that there is an overlap among them, but that one is accurate and the other one is mistaken. And a lot of people thought that Bergson's notion of time was a defense of the subjective part of that. But it was really more complex. So he, for example, went into quite a detail about the process of reading a clock or reading time, which, you know, we just actually think that we go like this and we can determine the time. And Bergson said, well, actually, that is a reading operation that takes place on time. And then there were other, you know, very important philosophers like Martin Heidegger, who noted the irony that every measure of time needs to occur outside of time, in a time that's so delayed, because if it were really long, then a bunch of other things would happen, and you wouldn't be getting that sort of, you know, measurement of time. And on top of that, you know, Bergson would say, well, there's reading and there's memory, because if you see a dial and you don't know what the number 7 is, like people with Alzheimer's, then you don't know what time is. So you're already smuggling into the subjective notion of time a subjective, a richer notion that takes into consideration memory, etc. But Einstein would have, you know, none of it, and it was just all too complicated, and it took away what he was really trying to do. In addition to giving to the world, you know, a wonderful theory of time, he was also trying to lift up the profile and the role of science as having the authority to speak about time. And that's the moment in history in which, so, you know, right now, if any of you want to know about time, you probably would read, you know, Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. But that's very recent. Before the Einstein-Bergson debate, people who would want to find out of time would probably read poetry, or read theology, or read philosophy, because that aspect of those poetic, feeling, emotional, meaningful aspects of time hadn't been relegated so starkly to the realm of, you know, art that supposedly has no purchase in reality.
I think it's fascinating because I've always perceived time in a way that, very much like you're describing, was connected to a more spiritual experience. And I think that's what informed what came out for Slow It Down. I think Slow It Down is a reflection overall on perception, which I think has something to do with connection. And
absolutely.
This, again, it has a subjective nature. But it's really fascinating to think that before, it naturally wasn't a thing that was, as you said, relegated to science, or that was even defined by science, and that it was actually something that people would go to theology, like you said, or spirituality, or art, as in poetry, as you mentioned. And I wonder if there isn't some validity in that, in spite of the science.
I think you proved that it is, you know, and that we're all, you know, still driven by these other aspects of time, and that we're, you know, a bit unsatisfied with having such a stark break between the sort of, you know, the scientific, even if the scientific includes the neuroscientific, that's set aside from the philosophical and artistic. And another word that, you know, I love that you said, that's a bit of as a prayer. You know, if you listen to your lyrics, there's that aspect of, and to you know, many other songs of repetition. But repetition, again, is something that Bergson and other philosophers have asked for us to think more carefully. And all clocks slow down. And absolute repetition is something that scientists have not been able to find.
Absolute repetition. Something
that does not degrade in the universe, even atomic clocks, radioactivity. So Einstein ended up thinking very carefully about, it took him a while. So while he gave a quick answer to what time was, and it was, you know, what time is what clocks measured, it took him a long time to answer the other question, what is a clock? and there he, I mean, it was later in life in a co-authored book, and he said, everything can be defined as a clock, because you can't have a clock that's outside of the universe. So I think we have a great argument to make that, what you're telling us about time needs to be taken, seriously and have in terms of the actual universe that we live in a way that's not relegated just to sort of,
That's kind of.
Well, it's like what struck me in reading your book is that Einstein, who's become synonymous with the physical world and science, and I think there are moments where he's kind of he's criticizing Bergson for saying that's metaphysics, that's the immaterial world, but he's decidedly spiritual. Like, he has that famous quote, "God doesn't play dice with the universe." Can you tell us a little, like, some more anecdotes about Einstein's spirituality or other instances where the spiritual and the physical have become intertwined for him?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very well-known quote when Einstein was confronted with quantum mechanics, which has a different notion of time, and in that aspect of time, consciousness plays a role in changing, the fabric of time. And there's a great quote by Schrödinger where he says, every look at the clock makes the time shake and changes it, and that's also been proven in the world of the very little. So this is one of the big debates in science.
Quantum mechanics.
Quantum mechanics deals with the very little,
Yeah.
and time looks very different there.
Mm-hmm.
Einstein's theory of relativity deals with speeds close to the speed of light, with lengths that are universal scales, with the world of the really big.
Mm-hmm.
And the jury's still out as to which of these two are fundamental.
Mm-hmm.
But when he said that quote, the God doesn't play dice with the universe, to Niels Bohr responded, "Einstein, please don't tell God what to do."
By the way, so if you have questions, if you could just sort of ever so delicately make your way down the steps. We have a microphone here. We're going to have a few minutes. Before we do go to audience Q&A, I would be remiss if we didn't address the fact that I'm up on stage with two Mexican Americans, and I have this slide that talks about the psychology of time perception, and one of the components is cultural differences. When we first chatted, you talked about mañana or ahorita. I didn't know about ahorita, but could you...
Ahorita. Can you want to say anything, something?
Me about ahorita?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, ahorita is like right now. We're going to do that right now. Mañana is like, we're for sure going to do that later. Yeah.
But when you say, if you don't want to do something, have you ever, have had somebody tell you to change the diapers of your son and you say, yes, ahorita, and it never happens?
No, he's hit that age where you got to change them when it's time. When you say ahorita, it's getting changed.
Got it.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, so you're not, so that doesn't mean, ahorita doesn't mean like it's not like you're trying to
Brush it off.
Yeah.
Or like pacify.
Yeah.
It can for sure. Yeah.
Well, I think this sort of dream of having a cultural bubble in which there's a cultural agreement about time and language that's absolute amongst anybody, individuals from people to groups of people to is just not there. It's something that we sort out, that we talk about, that we need to negotiate, and it tells you a bit about the importance, I believe, of thinking about the role of the public sphere and the public square, and time in terms of communication rather than just measurement, and measurement as a rising out of the desire to relate with each other and coordinate with each other for things that have meaning for us.
Miguel, your mom is Mexican?
My mom is black.
Your mom is black, your dad is Mexican?
Yep.
And so with his family, have you, like, just off the top of your head, what are some of the primary cultural differences between Mexicans versus Americans?
Oh, I think I mean, kind of to your point, Jimena, like the times of the year are easy ones that are culturally relevant, and so we look forward to certain times of the year because culturally they're times where we know them to be significant moments of coming together. For example, Thanksgiving or birthdays are more significant for some reason on my father's side. That may just be a family thing, but yeah, I would say moments of time is I wouldn't say more important, but different times are more important on different sides of my cultural upbringings and making. So I don't know if that's kind of true for you as well, but yeah.
It's be hard. It'd be hard, but I guess I do think of the the weightier the valences about thinking about time that are are hierarchical, and within that there's, as we ascribe different words to different values to our knowledge of time, with science being in culturally, that's the pinnacle of the most objective, the most true aspect of time, and that has these valences where it's connected to Western culture, and it's largely male, and in the Einstein-Bergson debate, philosophy was feminized, and there was this idea that and this is it's the humanities are sort of feminized, so it's gendered. The sciences are called the hard sciences. The humanities are called the soft sciences. Supposedly backwards people and primitive people don't have the same. They haven't developed the high precision technologies that scientists have, nor do they have an ethics of time that's connected to sort of British punctuality. So these things get are value laden.
Oh, 100%.
And again, it shows that if we want to sort them out, we need to talk to each other, and then hopefully we can talk across fields and to begin with, across disciplines and across different groups of people. If we want to have a full understanding of time, which is those cannot be relegated or silenced or.
Meanwhile, it's crazy when you think of these primitive cultures who had their appreciation of time and their respect for time span millennia in the way that they documented and how they were calculating their calendars. We're so much more considerate of the longer term span as opposed to the industrialization maybe of time. I think is kind of what when you mentioned British. Sort of the British approach or whatever modern world. How crazy is that?
But some of the most well-known books, that David Landis, they do a complete equation between the degree of civilization of nations and empires and their timekeeping technologies, and this has been listed as one of the divides between civilized cultures and uncivilized cultures. Well, and it plays an interesting role because there's this narrative that Western people took the clock. The Jesuits took the clock to China, and the Chinese people were like, oh, that's so interesting because. But then Bergson kind of turned it around, in his conversation with Einstein, to make the point that we need to think about why we use clocks, because we care about going places that have meaning and we care about people. And he said if that wasn't part of time, that caring emotional aspect, clocks would have no meaning to us. They would be amusing bits of machinery. So that's, it's another argument to the provocation of thinking that there really is a richer fabric of which, music and art and what you tell us about time needs to be taken more seriously.
Speaking of, Miguel, before we go to the questions from the audience, I know that this year you're a scholar in residence at NYU. Could you just tell the audience a little bit about what you're doing there?
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for bringing that up. We've designed a curriculum around speaking chaos to power. I think it also does relate to time, not so much in physics, but in how over time in the past century and even before that, how people have strategized and organized to affect the kind of change that they want to see that makes their experience more equitable. This course that we've designed is specifically talking about how we can do so in the arts across all mediums, and how we can take the chaos that we see in our experience now in this paradigm, specifically in this country, but also because the globalization of everything, how we can do that in general to change the systems that are to better benefit the people who are coming up with the ideas that these industries are being built off of. So it's a tremendous honor that I get to do it, and we're certainly talking about time and how these sorts of changes are examples of how people have come together and strategized, organized, and mobilized in order to make the change, affect the kind of change that they want or we want. And we're sort of applying that to how we can do that in a modern day and moving forward.
Right on. Okay, we're running out of time, so I don't think we're gonna be able to get to everybody, but if you could please ask your question.
I'm glad that you asked the last question that you asked, because it's relevant to my ideas of time and language and how we perceive it through that lens. And I've recently been reading The Story of Her Life by Ted Chiang. And for those who don't know, it inspired the movie Arrivals, which is a sci-fi movie about a linguistic anthropologist who has the pleasure of kind of decoding why aliens have come to our planet. It's a huge sci-fi geeky movie, but you should watch it though.
Also time. Yeah, time.
Yeah, and she discovers so much about time and herself and the world that she's living in at the moment. And the book explores how emotion and language affects our perception of subjective time and then narrative, both personally and socially, and how that creates our reality. But more than that, it examines how it affects our narrative of sense of self and our purpose in the world. And Dr. Canales, you have the ability and knowledge to speak to time in a way none of us can. And Miguel, you have a gift to speak to it in a way that we all understand, but I know that's recently changed for you. So my question is, if we're defined by time and the idea that time is defined by how we talk about and refer to it in our everyday, how do you think that the way you talk about time has affected how you define yourself in the world that you live in?
I would say it certainly changed tremendously. I would relate, and I hope I'm answering the question. It was such a good question. I would say that how I described it, kind of in the outset of our conversation today, is my appreciation now is so much more deep and rich, and that I'm looking for ways to appreciate the time that I have, and find the things that are different in every day so as to log them differently. And really absorb them and, just hold on to them, as opposed to kind of make otherwise every day becomes the same, and the time slip is massive. So I try and be a little more aware these days.
Miguel, when thinking about your album War and Leisure, how intentional is it to have certain songs placed in, the order that they're in? I know Skywalker is kind of at the beginning, and that's much more upbeat, whereas Come Through and Chill kind of seems a little bit more relaxed. Just that in general, then, I guess after discussion of time and perceiving of time, how often is that on the forefront of your mind when, you want fans to maybe slow it down and listen a little bit more?
Good question. Different albums are arranged differently, just like different tour sets, I would say, or any set would be arranged differently. War and Leisure as an effort in terms of where it's placed in my career was very much, had a lot of outside influence in terms of the the reach of the music, if I'm being very, very honest. So for that album specifically, Skywalker had already had momentum in terms of awareness, and people loved the song, and so it was almost it made sense, you know, kind of in terms of anyone who knew me or knew the music. It was a great place to start because it was a point of reference, and then I could roll out the rest of the album. Whereas on CAOS, this album, it started out, the first song is more thematic to set the stage. That song actually describes a frame of mind and where I believe that the chaos that I curate in my life is valuable because it makes life interesting. And the rest of it is as a sort of coming to terms with that belief, maybe solving for it and evolving it. So it varies, it depends. Great question, thank you.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, so Miguel, I just want to say I love your music. It's amazing what you do. And in your song Nearsight, right, it's sort of a very slow song. And for you, I was wondering if that was sort of intentional, understanding the theme of in the lyrics of what you wrote about. Was this a more intentional decision to make the song more slow? And then for Mrs. Canales, I was just wondering, I was reading a bit about your work, and as you presented today, you argued that Bergson, what he thought about live time, it's more real than the clock time. So my question for you was, if our emotions can physically stretch or compress our perception of a moment, does that make an artist like Miguel's subjective version of time a more accurate than the physicist's objective one?
Definitely very intentional. And I love that second question. Someone let...
Yes, well, you know, beautifully stated. I think I'm very motivated, and you know, speaking to the person who did the first question, to try to you know, and I'm going to be very, very arrogant here, but one of the main quotes about time dates to 400 BC to Saint Augustine, and he was, you know, asked. He wrote in the Confessions. He said, "What is time? Well, if you don't ask me, I know. If you ask me, I don't." And it already pointed out to this, you know, bifurcation between an intellectual understanding of time. You know, if you ask me and you need to, you know, I tell you, it slips away and I no longer know. But if you don't, I feel it. I know what time is. And I'm very motivated to start a new millennium with another understanding of time that would tie the arts, the sciences, and the humanities in a different way that we've been doing it in the past, and that can speak to, you know, I'm not going to say that that Miguel's notion is more objective than the scientific one in this museum, but I want to think about it in a different way that we've been thinking about it so far.
All right, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, and I just want to let you all know, if you don't have plans tonight, Miguel is going to be at MGM Fenway. I don't know if there's still tickets left, but it's sold out. Well, you know, bang down the doors. Congratulations, Miguel. You know, I can't thank you enough for taking time to come here. Jimena, thank you so much. Thank you to the MIT Museum and to all of you.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Be sure to check out Miguel's new album, CAOS, and catch him on tour right now. For more information, please visit his website, officialmiguel.com. To learn more about Jimena's work, you can visit her website, jimenacanales.org. Sing for Science is co-produced by Talkhouse and made possible in part by a grant from the Simons Foundation. Our music is by Panoram. Social media manager is Bailey Constas, and our digital producer is Keenan Cush. Special thanks to Kate Silverman-Wilson, Keelan Caldwell, Sasha Wallinger, and everyone at the MIT Museum for helping making this episode possible. If you like Sing for Science, the best way you can support us is to give us a review, tell a friend about the show, and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. For more information, please visit singforscience.org and follow us on social media at Sing for Science. Thanks for listening.